Okay, so Puppeteer. Just kidding. I'm Carmen. You can follow me on Twitter. You can check out my blog. Margie Map is a map that I work on. It shows a visualization of income to internet, to libraries which provide internet. You should check it out. It's really sweet. I've done some talks about it, so I love it, and I'd love to talk to you about it, so hit me up. You might be wondering, what is Puppeteer? Has anybody in here used Puppeteer, familiar with it? Okay, all right. You'll have to keep me honest. Has anybody in here done any web scraping with a thing besides Puppeteer? Maybe not even in JavaScript. Seeing a couple more hands. So Puppeteer can be used for a lot of things. In this particular talk, we're going to talk about web scraping. So Puppeteer is a Node API for Headless Chrome. Headless Chrome is a program that Chrome has put out to be able to use their browser without a GUI and to be able to automate things. Puppeteer has an API to control Headless Chrome. And it also uses the DevTools protocol, which is pretty cool. You should check it out. So I already mentioned a couple things that Puppeteer can be useful for. But you can use it to generate screenshots and PDFs of web pages. You can also pass in HTML, which is really handy. I'm going to show you guys an example of that later on. You can automate form submission for UI testing. This is a really big thing that people like to use Puppeteer for, is combining it with other testing suites to help make their testing better. You can capture a trace to help diagnose performance issues. And you can do web scraping. The first and last one are what we're going to do in this talk today. Really quick note about asynchronous JavaScript in Puppeteer. So typically when we're using asynchronous JavaScript, we're using promises, right? And we're using the .then syntax. Puppeteer doesn't do that really. You can, but typically Puppeteer uses async and await. So if you're not familiar with that, you will be by the end of this talk. You can use the .then syntax if you want to. I don't know if I could recommend it, and you'll see here a couple examples where it's like you would have like, what did they used to say, callback what? I don't want to say it because we're on the stream, but you guys know what I'm talking about. So you would have that with promises. It would be like way over because of all the nesting. So I would definitely use async and await. It makes for cleaner code. So let's control some stuff. So a little bit about Puppeteer before we jump into some code. You're going to see this a lot, this browser. It's a class. When you launch Puppeteer, you get an instance of a browser back. If you wanted to, you could, it has a whole bunch of different options in the launch function, but if you set headless to false, it'll actually pop up a window for you to see what all is going on, which if you're doing like form inputs or like other DOM manipulation, that can be kind of cool to watch. You'll just want to make sure that you put like a set timeout in there because it's really, really fast. And so literally like if you blink, you can miss it. So just keep that in mind. The other thing you're going to see a lot of is this concept of a page. This is another class. It provides methods where you can interact with a tab or extension. A browser can contain multiple pages. You might also see this called a tab, but essentially it's just your DOM. So if we wanted to navigate to a web page, this is probably the very most simple example you'll see. We have to require Puppeteer. And then we've got that async function I was telling you about. Within that, you've got a browser. That's puppeteer.launch. Like I said, it takes in a bunch of options, but you don't really have to pass in any, and you can do, most things that you're going to see in this presentation. You're going to instantiate a page. So that's browser.newPage. You can set your viewport. That's important for if you're like taking screenshots or if you want to see your page. So you can define the width and height. And then the second to last line, that page.goto, that's just you're passing in a URL and you're saying, hey, go to this page. And then at the end of it, you want to close, because if you don't close the browser, then you could get a memory leak and it would be bad. Making sense so far? All right, super. So if you wanted to take a screenshot, that's going to look incredibly similar to what we were just doing. So you'll notice that there's really only one line of difference, and I even marked it with a comment where it says this is the important part. So you launch Puppeteer again, you go to the new page, well, you instantiate the new page, excuse me. You can set your viewport, you go to it. Once you're there, you can simply call page.screenshot and pass in the options being path. That's really, really important if you don't want it to end up in the same directory that you're currently running your program from. If you want it in like a screenshots directory, you have to specify that as part of the path. And then full page, I always set to true, but you can tell it like only take this section of the page if you want to get really fancy. And then we close it. That's about it. Pretty simple. Everybody good so far? All right, great. You can get a page source. So that's like, does anybody ever use this anymore where you like, or are you guys all just like me where it's like you try to inspect but you hit page source instead and you're like, I don't want this. Well, just in case you do actually want that, this is how you would do it. Just a quick note, I have ellipses just to kind of show for the next several examples that we're still in an async function. You can't run this stuff outside of an async function, but it was getting really unwieldy. So that's what those mean. So we're instantiating the browser, instantiating the page. You notice on the goTo function this time, there's a second parameter, an object. What network idle to means is we go to the page and then we wait until there's no more network requests. And what network idle to specifically means is that there haven't been 2 network requests in the last 500 milliseconds. That's really important because like when you're loading in CSS, when you're loading in JavaScript, when you're loading in everything, those are all happening over network. And so you want to wait until that's actually all been completed before you grab all the content or execute whatever code you're wanting to execute. And then I marked it again where it says this is the important part. What we're going to do is we're just going to call page.content, and that'll give you the entire source code of the page, all of the markup, all of the value, everything, the whole thing. And then, whatever you'd want to do with that, maybe you want to write it to a file yourself, or, whatever you want to do, you would do that next. And then again, at the end, we always want to close our browser so we don't get memory leaks. So a little bit more about Puppeteer and some examples. But before we dive into those, I want to talk to you about some extra functions. So it has this really handy wait for selector function. And so that accepts a selector. And you can get really super specific with it. So you could do like paragraph.class, child, and you can go really, really far out. It's very handy. And so what that does is that waits for that specific selector to appear in the page. This is really important for client-side rendered apps where, maybe stuff is there when it loads in and maybe it's not. So if there's something specific that you're waiting for, you can use wait for selector and it'll pause until that selector is actually in the page. And I have an example showing why that's important. Page.evaluate is another really common one that I've run across. So it accepts a function parameter, and it's not executing that function in your Puppeteer file. It's actually executing that in the DOM. And so if you're wanting to get element by ID or any other DOM manipulation, you would pass it in through a page.evaluate. Yes, that'll return whatever so if you did like get element by ID, that'll return the actual element back into your Puppeteer file. Does that make sense? Super. And then we already talked about network idle to, but again, it's just indicating that navigation is complete. There aren't any more network requests, and there haven't been for 500 milliseconds. So if you wanted to get a list of GitHub repos, this is how you might do it. We're going to my GitHub page, and notice at the top we've figured out what selector we want, that very first repo links. And we are using wait for selector, because it's not necessarily going to be there when you first hit the page. So you want to make sure that the selector that you want actually exists on your page, or else you'll get Puppeteer's errors are kind of not easy to read. It usually looks like a promise rejection, and you're just like, this is not specific, what's going on? So it's helpful if you wait for selectors, and anything that you are planning on accessing while you're in the page, just make sure that it's actually there before you try to access it. So then this right here is page.evaluate. So we're passing in a function where we use a query selector. We pass in repo links, which is the very specific thing that I'm looking for. That's going to return a node collection. I forget exactly what it's called, but it doesn't return an array. So we convert that to an array, and we map over it, and then we just return the link to the specific array. And so if you were to swap this out for, say, your GitHub page, what you would get is your top 30 repository links in an array. And then you could write that to a file or whatever else you were wanting to do. I want to make a really quick note about screen scraping. Between you and me, I wouldn't do it this way. GitHub has a really, really sweet API that you could use, and it is way, way easier. I would really only do screen scraping in the event that there's not a really great API. But lucky for you, I have an example of that too.
Carmen?
Yes?
What is network idle 2?
Network idle 2?
Okay.
Yeah, so it just waits to make sure that there haven't been any network connections in the last 500 milliseconds. It's really important to make sure that all of your files have been loaded in, your JavaScript and your CSS and all that stuff. All right, everybody good? So, even more about Puppeteer. I know you guys are loving it. So what we're going to see in our next example is some actual DOM interaction. So I wanted to list off a couple of functions so that you know what they are before we see them in the example. This first one, focus, this probably looks a lot like methods that you would use in a JavaScript file, and they're really similarly named. That's intentional. This will accept a selector, and it'll put focus on it. So if you give it like an input box, it'll put focus on the input box. Page.keyboard.type, it will actually simulate key presses. So if you have an event listener on a specific key press, this is a really great way to make sure that that's actually being triggered. And it'll also input text into like a text box or a text area or anything like that. Click is probably pretty self-explanatory, but again, it accepts a selector and it simulates a click on it. So if you have navigation on a click, or if you have an event listener or anything like that, that's a great way to make sure that that's working as expected. And then wait for. Wait for is really, really similar to wait for selector, which we saw before, except that this one will accept a function. And so it's really, really handy for, I actually have an example of this coming up. If you want to make sure that a value is there, you can pass a function into wait for, and it will pause, essentially, your program until the value is there. I don't want to give too much away, but I have an example of that. So this is like my favorite one that I did, because I feel really rebellious. Does anybody in here have student loans? You don't have to tell me. I do. So between you and me, if you have Great Lakes, you can use this too. I'm sorry. So the problem that I was having was that like my specific site doesn't store historical data, and I'm a busy person. I can't remember to go in and check it every single day, and so I was like, haha, you can't trick me. I will write a screen scraping application, because naturally they're not going to provide an API. So this one is quite a few more steps. But the first step is those functions I was showing you before where we're actually doing DOM interaction. So initially, we've seen this a whole bunch of times. We're going to go to the specific URL where our site is. Again, if you have Great Lakes, this will work for you. Run it on a Raspberry Pi. You can be a rebel like me. So we're going to focus on that specific ID. In this case, that ID is an input box. So we focus on it, and then we put in a username. We're going to click, it's a next button, essentially. And so for some reason, they've broken it out into multiple pages, so that's why this is so big. Once we click next, we've got another selector, another input box. We focus on it, we put in the next piece of data, we click next, and then that third section, these all look really similar. It's another page with another input box. You put in the data, you click next. So that part's kind of boring. This is where the wait for comes in real handy. So after I've logged in, at the end of that last example, like we put in data and we click next and we do that a bunch of times, then you actually, you're logged in and you get into the page you want to be in. So fortunately, they were really nice. Yes?
I'm assuming this follows redirects?
Yes, there's actually a wait for navigation function you can use. Yes, the question was, does this follow redirects? And yes, it does. There's a wait for navigation function you can use where it's like page.wait for navigation, and it'll wait for the redirect to be complete and then continue. That wasn't something I used in here because I used wait for selector instead, which kind of achieved the same thing. So my particular program tracks the current balance, the unpaid interest, and the unpaid principal and unpaid interest. So it ended up in this really funny thing that you get with client-side apps, where just because the selector is there does not mean that the value from their API call is in the selector, right? So you load in your template, and then after that, you get your API back, you get your API return back, and then you load in everything, right? Is this familiar? Okay. So I was running into this problem where it was like it was working, but I wasn't getting my expected output. I was getting a bunch of undefines, and that was because of I don't happen to know what client-side rendering they're using, like if it's Angular or React or what it is, but it was giving me this problem. And so that's where I passed that function into wait for. And so I'll show you what that looks like. Essentially, all it's doing is it's targeting the value of the input, and it's saying, if it's not empty string, then you can continue. And so it'll pause at each wait for, and it'll say, is this empty string? And if it's not, it'll go to the next, and it'll go to the next. And it'll just continue on like that. Does everybody follow? Great. So this is where we actually get to scrape the data. Yay! It's really sad data, I'm sorry to tell you, because it's student loans, right? So we're going to use page evaluate, and we're just going to do some DOM. It's not manipulation, but some interaction. We're going to use get element by ID and target the inner HTML. That gets returned back to Puppeteer, because remember, when you execute something in page.evaluate, it's actually executing in the DOM. It's not executing in Puppeteer. And so you always, always, always want to return it back so it can get back to the variable. Everybody follow? And then at the end of that, I've got the data that I want. I can use Node to write it to a file or do whatever I want with it. Once that's completed, I can close my browser. Everybody good? So we're going to also generate a PDF with Puppeteer. It's really, really similar. We're going to start out by launching the browser. We're going to instantiate a new page. We're going to tell it to go to a specific URL. And then we're going to call page.pdf. If you've ever tried to generate a PDF on your own, I have, and it's terrible. It is not a fun thing to try to do. So I was super stoked when I found that Puppeteer had this, relatively simple method that I could just call. And I actually am using it in a project. So it takes in, PDF takes in a whole bunch of options. If you leave out the options, it'll probably work. It's going to default to like 8.5 by 11, like normal page size PDF. If you want something more specified, that's when your options are going to come in real handy. But the one that you absolutely want to have is path, and that is where you give it the name of your PDF. And also, again, I'd mentioned with screenshots, if you want it to go to a different directory than where you're running the file, you want to specify that in your file path as well. Everybody good with that? So I had also mentioned that you can actually pass markup into Puppeteer, which is what I'm doing in a project. I have a project where someone comes in and they fill out a form, and based on their form inputs, I generate a PDF for them. And this is essentially how I'm doing it. Obviously, like, I'm not hard coding my HTML, but I end up with the HTML from what they've put into the form, and then instead of page.goto, we use page.setContent. And so you don't have to have a live website to be able to use this. You can just have markup and pass it in, and it'll treat it like it's a live website. So you do page.setContent, that renders it for you in their DOM, and then you just call await page.pdf the exact same way. And then you close the browser. I can't stress that enough. You really want to close your browser. And that's not all. Do you guys want to see some demos? Yes. Yes. Okay, sweet. Here's the funny thing about showing demos of automated stuff is it's like, I'm going to type it in and it's going to be like, oh, that's really cool, because it's like, oh, it's done. Yes. Yes. Can I make it larger? Is that better? Okay. Enhance. So if we were going to generate a PDF with markup, we would just, run that. Generate PDF with markup. So this is the one where we're passing in the HTML. There is no, maybe there is, but I didn't make a web page that says hello OKC.js. Is that better? Okay, sweet. So I'm going to run this, and yay! Okay, so I'm going to show you what it actually did. Pop this open. Nope. And samples, and then PDFs, and I think this was the most recent one. It made a PDF for us, yay! So it's not like super exciting like writing a game or something where you like have something like really, really neat to show for it at the end, but I can tell you for me, it was super helpful to be able to use in my project where I didn't have to figure out how to convert a byte array into a PDF and like all of those shenanigans. Like being able to just have some markup and throw it into Puppeteer and come back with a PDF was just, it saved me, weeks of time for sure. And then also the student loans one, like I said, it was kind of cool because I was like, haha, you can't trick me, student loan place. So if we run that, I'm only going to show you guys this one really quick because I don't want you guys to be sad for me at how much money I owe. But anyway, that is in here. So you can see like every day it's running and it's tracking that for me so that I don't have to, log in every single day because I'm not going to remember to do, like, we're busy people, So showed you some demos. Are there any Puppeteer questions? Yes. Can Puppeteer do multi-page? Yes, it can. So what you would do is you would just you could store it in like an object or something, but remember when we did launch Puppeteer and we instantiated a browser? A browser can have multiple pages. Oh, yes, yes it can. I have an example of that. I'm glad you asked. So if we did generate PDF. So what this does is it takes a screenshot of like my blog, and it actually looks pretty good, I feel like. Not my blog, like the PDF. The blog looks good too. I'm like putting my foot in my mouth over here. So yeah, it does, this is what it ends up looking like. It's like really long because I talk a lot, but yeah, it will do multi-page for you. And you can go a lot further with the formatting than what I showed in the example. Like you can get like really, really specific with how you want it formatted. In the examples, I kept it pretty basic. Does that answer your question? Yes.
Yeah, have you found any shortcomings in its ability to screen scrape?
Have I found any shortcomings to its ability to screen scrape? I thought it was very fully featured and really powerful. The biggest complaint I had about screen scraping was just how really tedious it is. I mean, I can't stress enough, like if there's an available API that you can use instead, like genuinely I would do that. But if you need to generate PDFs, I thought that was really great. You know, historical screenshots, that's really great. Being able to execute a function within the DOM itself was just like, it was incredibly helpful. I wouldn't have been able to achieve this stuff without it. So overall, I would say no. I think it's a really, really great program. Any more? Yes.
So two things. You mentioned you had that running every day. Is there a way to automate that, or is that more of a question?
The question was, is there a way to automate the run every day? So I mentioned in the tracking the student loan data that it runs every day. Within Puppeteer, I don't know of a way to automate it every day. I wrote another program, and it's running on a Raspberry Pi. So basically, it just calls out to this. So was there?
And then the second question was, do they talk about any like big real-world projects that depend on this or use this?
The question was, are there any real, like, big real-world projects? I know people use it for a lot of automated testing. So they pair it with their testing suite, and they run it through Puppeteer. I'm working on a more personal project with it. I don't know of any, like, big companies that are using it. I'm sure they're out there. I just didn't think to look that up. More questions? Yes? Lighthouse? Oh.
Integrated Chrome like analytics.
Okay, okay.
And you can do that standalone.
Oh, nice. So Lighthouse uses it. So, yeah, awesome. That's really cool. Yes?
Can the PDF save to a stream, or is it only a file?
Can the PDF save to a stream? I don't know. I haven't tried to do that. I just saved it to a file. Good? All right. I was just kidding. That's not all. Vance mentioned Thunder Plains. I'm going to be there. I'm going to be talking about service workers. If you want to save some coin, you can use OKC.js 18. And it's awesome, and you should go. Seriously, I love Thunder Plains. And that's it.